Welcome everyone. In this live stream, we will be going to read Block 3 from MEG3, and MEG3 is British novel and Block 3 is about Wuthering Heights. And in this particular video, we are going to read Unit 1, Background to Wuthering Heights. The topics we will be covering in this video will be objectives, dates, location of Wuthering Heights, Industrial Revolution, and changing society, romanticism, rebellion. Let us sum up, glossary, questions, suggested reading. We might skip questions because we're just gonna read the text so that everyone can learn from the text. So without further ado, let's just begin. And a disclaimer, just before we begin, there might be loud noises in the background, and this is how the neighborhood is, and we don't have soundproofing as of now, so you might have to bear with it. So let's start. 1.0 Objectives. In this unit, we will position the text of Wuthering Heights within a historical and social context. The socio-economical, political, and cultural environment of mid-19th century England is of immense importance to our study of the novel. It provides us with the background for critical study of the novel as the product of the culture in a particular time and place. This is not to suggest that novel is relevant only within its historical context, but let us read between the lines and discern how the author is able to question many of the values and attitudes of time and how many of these questions are still relevant to us as modern readers. This unit also introduces us to many of the issues that come up for discussion in the following units. 1.1 Dates. Wuthering Heights begin with a date, 1801. Dates are important because they place events in place within historical context. In fiction, dates help in making the story seem real. Date becomes more significant when events and people, fictional or otherwise, need to be critically examined beyond their historical time. The fact that this novel is worth reading and studying after 150 years since its publication cannot be overlooked. In the last decade of the 20th century, we in India are post-colonial readers studying this novel, which was written in English language and was published 10 years before the Sepoy Mutiny, 1857, and almost 10 years after abolition of sati. Apparently, there seemed to be no connection between these historical events in India and the publication of the novel. But when we examine the social, political, economical condition of England at the time when the Emily Bronte was writing, it is evident that novel reflects, however indirectly, the impact and implication of major social changes that were taking place in the society at that time. The English colonial and imperial interests in India could not have not affected by those changes. So, for the Indian readers, the cultural productions, literature holds a primary position of colonial and imperial power, becomes the starting point of the critical analysis of the polemics of domination and subservience. Though it is only one of the aspects of the novel that could interest in the Indian reader, yet it is an important one. From a biographical perspective, the historical milieu forming the backdrop to Emily Bronte's life cannot be ignored. Critics have pointed out that there is contrast and contradiction between the images of Emily Bronte as the extraordinary woman, the romantic genius, the writer, and the Emily Bronte, the self-contained and, on the whole, dutiful daughter of an Anglo-Catholic clergyman. In many ways, Emily Bronte was typical 19th century woman, private, domestic, and hidden from history. It is manifestation of her uniquely imaginative mind and her keen and intuitive understanding of the historical significance of her times that in the novel, Emily Bronte is able to look beyond the constraints of the typical Victorian and anticipate the new forms of the family and social life that were emerging. Let us make a list of some of the dates that are important for the study of Wuthering Heights. 1757. Philosophical inquiry into origin of ideas of the sublime and beautiful. Edmund Burke. In 1757 summer, Hindley Earnshaw is born. 1762, Edgar Linton is born. 1764, Heathcliff is born. 1765, Isabella is born. 1765 summer, Catherine is born. 1767, James Hargreaves invents the spinning jenny, which marks the beginning of dramatic changes that takes place in the production, marketing, procurement of the raw material in textile industry. Liverpool and Manchester being the two major industrial cities and textile centers. 1771, Heathcliff comes to Wuthering Heights as a child. 1773, death of Mrs. Earnshaw. 1776, Wealth of Nation Adam Smith. 1777, death of Mr. Earnshaw. 1778, June, Hareton is born. 1780 autumn, death of Mr. Linton. 1784 September, Linton Heathcliff is born. 1784 September, death of Hindley. 1784 March 20, Cathy is born. 1784 20th March, death of Catherine. 1784 January, Heathcliff marries Isabella. 1789 Songs of Innocence, William Blake. 1789 The French Revolution, the beginning of Republic and the rise of Napoleon. 1791 Boswell's The Life of Samuel Johnson, published. 1792 Rights of Man, Tom Paine Band. 1797 June, death of Isabella. 1798 Lyrical Ballads, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. In 1800, the second edition was published, which contained the celebrated preface that became the handbook of Romantic period poetry. Principle of Population, Robert Matthews. 1801 September, death of Edgar Linton. 1801 August, Cathy marries Linton Heathcliff. 1802 May, death of Heathcliff. 1803 January, Cathy marries Hareton. 1805 October, the Battle of Trafalgar, Britain's naval superiority established. 1814 Mansfield Park, Jane Austen. 1818 30th July, Emily Bronte was born at her father's parsonage at Thornton, Bradford. She was the fifth child and Anne was her younger sister, born on 17th January 1820. 1818 Frankenstein by Mary Shelley was written. 1818 to 1820 John Keats wrote the important odes. 1819 to 1824 Don Juan by Lord Byron. 1820 Prometheus Unbound, Percy Bysshe Shelley. 1829 Steam engine named Rocket, built by Robert Stephenson, reaches a prize-winning speed of 29 kilometers per hour. 1832 the first reform bill was laid. 1833, abolition of slavery in England. This was soon followed by Factory Act, which prohibited the employment of children under 9 in spinning and weaving factories. 1837, King William IV was succeeded by his niece Victoria as the Queen of England. 1837-1839, Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens was published. 1838, the beginning of Chartist movement. 1845, famine in Ireland, anti-corn law agitation, reappeal of corn law by Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel in 1846. 1845 August, Branwell's visit to Liverpool, and Emily begins to write Wuthering Heights in autumn and winter of the year. 1847 December, Wuthering Heights published along with Anne Bronte's IGNOU MEG03 by T.C. Newby, London. The sister used pseudonyms. Emily called herself Alice Bell and Charlotte Acton Bell. 1848, the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx. 1848 December, death of Emily Bronte. 1850 in memoriam, Lord Alfred Tennyson. 1859 on liberty, John Stuart Mill. 1859 Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. So after we have read these dates, let's just begin with another paragraph from the text. Dates and events listed above span a little over 100 years. You could make a more detailed list include many other important events that occurred during this time. I have listed only, and when I say I have, basically I'm reading from the text, so this is not really me. This is from the textbook from IGNOU. So again, I'll begin. I have listed only some of the notable events which I feel are directly or indirectly related to the text. The dates specifically connected with the story of Wuthering Heights have been intentionally arranged chronologically along with the dates of major events and happening of the time to facilitate a meaningful juxtaposition. Though the novel was written in year 1845, the story is placed in the last quarter of the 18th century. In 1801, Lockwood becomes a tenant of Heathcliff and stays at Thrushcross Grange. Nellie Dean, the then housekeeper of Thrushcross Grange, recapitulates to Lockwood the history of Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange and begins her tale from the arrival of Heathcliff at Wuthering Heights 30 years before, 1871. Nellie Dean's story hardly touches upon the social world outside the periphery of Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. She concentrates on the lives of just the people who live in the two houses in tightly defined domestic system. But as our chart will show, many important historical events were taking place at that time and find no mention in Nellie Dean's recapitulation. Maybe it is because Nellie herself had no experience of the outer world as she spends her entire life with the confines of Wuthering Heights and of Thrushcross Grange. Maybe it is because Nellie herself had no experience of the outer world as she spends her entire life within confines of Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. But is there no connection between these historical events and the story of Wuthering Heights? How isolated are the inmates of Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange from social history of their times? Was the writer Emily Bronte unaware of the events taking place in her time or during the time period of the novel's setting? These are some questions we will have to answer as we go along. Okay, so we just finished reading 1.1. Now we will begin reading 1.2. The location of Wuthering Heights. The story of Wuthering Heights is narrated by Lockwood, but Lockwood is not a detached narrator, for he shares his opinion about what he sees with his readers. In his opinion, the location of his new accommodation at Thrushcross Grange is certainly a beautiful country, but is also so completely removed from the stir of society. A misanthropist heaven, he calls it, without realizing the ironic significance of such an oxymoron. As one reads the story, which is a flashback narration, one is tempted to believe, along with Lockwood, that such events could have only taken place in the isolation. Early reading and interpretation of Wuthering Heights reinforced the association of excessive passion and its disastrous consequences. This was helped by biographical material about Emily Bronte that stressed her shy, lonely, and introverted nature. In a review of Wuthering Heights that appeared in Athenaeum on 25th December 1847, the reviewer is quite clear that, in spite of its truth to the life in remote nooks and corners of England, the Wuthering Heights is a disagreeable story. The brutal master of the lonely house of Wuthering Heights, a prison which might be pictured from life, has doubtless his prototype in those uncongenial and remote districts where human beings, like trees, grow gnarled and dwarfed distorted by inclement climate. If the bells, singly or collectively, are contemplating future or frequent utterance in fiction, let us hope that they will spare us further interiors so gloomy as one here elaborated with such dismalness. Charlotte Bronte, in the preface to 1850 edition of Wuthering Heights, shares with us her perception that her sister's disposition was not naturally gregarious. Circumstances favored and fostered her tendency to seclusion. Though her feeling for the people around was benevolent, intercourse with them she never sought, nor, with few exceptions, ever experienced. And yet she knew their ways, their language, their family histories. She could hear of them with interest, and talk of them with details, minute, graphic, and accurate, but with them she rarely exchanged a word. Charlotte traces the genesis of the characters in Wuthering Heights by asserting that Emily Bronte's limited but detailed observation of the people around her was too exclusively confined to those tragic and terrible traits which Emily's memory is sometimes compelled to receive the impress, and that Emily's imagination, which was spirit more somber than sunny, more powerful than sportive, found in such traits material whence it brought creation like Heathcliff, like Earnshaw, like Catherine. Finally, in a most impressionistic and memorable manner, Charlotte concludes, Wuthering Heights was hewn in wild workshop with simple tools, out of homely materials. The statuary found a granite block on a solitary moor. Gazing thereon, he saw how from crag might be elicited a head, savage, swart, sinister, form molded with at least one element of grandeur power. He wrought with the crude chisel, and from no model but the vision of his meditations. With time and labor, the crag took human shape, and there it stands colossal, dark and frowning, half statue, half rock. In the former sense, terrible and goblin-like. In the latter, almost beautiful, for its coloring is mellow grey, and moorland moss clothes it, and heath, with its blooming bells and balmy fragrance, glows faithfully close to the giant's foot. Charlotte's view about the genesis of her sister's novel is apologetic and seeks to monumentalize the work. Charlotte knew that the contemporary Victorian audience may be unsympathetic and hostile towards her sister's novel. So she tried to soften the harsh, vile, and disturbing aspects of the novel by presenting the portrait of author as a female genius that did not seriously disrupt the prevailing notions of femininity. The preface nevertheless contains within it the basic tenor of the most of the early criticism of the novel. There emerged two distinct types of views about the novel. One was that it was powerful, dark, intense, somber, tragic kind of fierce poetry, and other that it was action-laden in hell, brutal, rude, repellent, and generally a terrible experience. Many of early critics found both these qualities intertwined in the novel, one not necessarily cancelling the other. At a time when the novel as a literary genre was sought to be interpreted as something more than a form of entertainment, critics began to distinguish the serious novel from the plain entertaining ones. The serious novels were generally thought to be more didactic and celebrated or exemplified orthodox morality, which has supposed to have beneficial effect on the moral sensibility of the reader. Wuthering Heights rudely challenged such neat categories and posed a challenge to the early critics. Both these early critical perspectives nevertheless did not question the seeming historical remoteness of the novel. It was accepted that a novel of such kind that deals primarily with the basic and intuitive aspects of human heart and soul necessarily must remain outside historical time. Issues that novel is primarily concerned with those of individual right, ethics of love and marriage, inheritance and property, civilization and nature may be issues and ideas in culture. And may be issues that cut across time and space, but they are not removed from social history or the history of ideas and culture. The novel may be studied against the late 18th century or early 19th century historical background of England, as well as the social and the historical setting of the time it is being read. There have been dramatic shifts in the reader response to the novel since its publication. These shifts had not only been marked by time periods but also by society, culture, and gender of the reader. Okay, so we just finished reading 1.2. Let us read 1.3. 1.3 Industrial Revolution. The last quarter of 18th century and the first half of the 19th century was a period of great social, economic and cultural change in England. These 75 years saw the consolidation of England as most powerful imperial nation. The English Empire expanded globally to an extent that British came to believe that the sun would never set on it. This was also the period of rapid industrialism and the development of the full-scale capitalism, with its accompanying the cycle of boom and slump and the continuous and the intense class conflict. Industrialization signaled the end of domestic system of manufacture and introduced the factory system, which displaced the rural population to the centers of urban growth, which were generally cities with factories. This was inevitably accompanied by the growth of slums, squalor, poverty, and disease. Cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis were rampant, and many people, mostly poor workers, died of these dread diseases. Medicine and healthcare system were non-existent, and postnatal deaths were quite frequent. Frances, Catherine, I'll just read this line again. Frances, Catherine, and Isabella. So I'm again sorry. I'll read this again. I think there's some punctuation error in the writing, or maybe I'm just reading it wrong. So I'll begin again. Frances, Catherine, and Isabella, Edgar, and Linton Heathcliff all died due to illness. Emily Bronte died at the age of only 30, suffering from tuberculosis. By the end of 18th century, economic principles of laissez-faire, as advocated by Adam Smith in his book of Wealth of Nations, was being seriously questioned by thinkers like Tom Paine, authors of Rights of Man, 1798. Poor wages and dismal working conditions characterized the early factory system. Men, women, and children worked in the hazardous condition as part of the system of the production, in which the profits went to the captains of the industry. This unequal distribution of wealth added to the growing dissatisfaction amongst the poor workers, resulting in the conflict between the haves and the have-nots. This period of English history is marked by the violent food riots, protest, and demonstration by working class. E. P. Thompson, in his book The Making of English Working Class, published in London by Victor Galaxis Limited, 1963, traces the history of the working class movement during this early phase of industrialization. If you wish to go into this aspect, you may like to read this book. It is a fairly long book, but will provide you very useful background material. The Luddite riots, the struggles and the agitation around the first Reform Bill, the growth of trade unionism, and the fight for improved working conditions in the factories was followed by agitation against poor law of 1834, and finally culminated in the Chartist movement from 1838 to 1848. The year that Emily Bronte died, 1848, Karl Marx published the Communist Manifesto, a seminal text in which the working class leadership and intelligentsia found a sound theoretical basis for their struggle. Okay, next paragraph. The introduction of machines and the cultivation of cash crop resulted in surplus labor in agrarian sector. People began to migrate from the villages to the cities. By the last quarter of 18th century, many Irishmen had left their peasant homes and immigrated to England and sought work in mills and factories in cities like Manchester and Liverpool. They formed the poorest section of the slum dwellers. Emily Bronte's father, Patrick O'Bronte, was born in 1777 as a son of poor peasant in the County Down, a picturesque area in the Northern Ireland. He too migrated to England, but unlike the other, he did not become a low-paid worker, but by 1802 was at Cambridge University, from where he received a degree. He joined the clergy and rose rapidly from migrant Irish peasant to respectable Anglican clergyman. In 1820, a few months after the birth of his youngest daughter Anne, Mr. Bronte shifted his residence to Haworth, a big village near Keighley in the industrial district of Yorkshire. There was nothing so completely removed from the stir of the society than Haworth. It was located near one of the most rapidly growing industrial areas of England. In fact, West Riding was the center of many working class movements and uprisings. Though connected with the church, Mr. Bronte was apolitical. He had strong political views which he often discussed with his intellectually alive children. He got himself actually involved in the riots and lockouts by assisting the locked out workers of his parish. Emily and her sister Charlotte did not spend their entire lives in Haworth. They went to school at Halifax, where Chartist movement was very strong. In 1838, on Hartshead Moor, a few miles away from Halifax, one of the biggest Chartist torch light rallies took place. Queen Victoria, by an official proclamation in 1938, declared all such torchlight meetings as illegal participation, in which meant punishment. Emily and Charlotte also went to Bradford, Keighley and Leeds. It is true that Emily did not write about social and political climate of her time directly, but it is certainly does not mean that she was not aware of the changes that were happening around her, or that these events were not part of her social world. Now let us read 1.4, The Changing Society. In the real terms, industrialism meant an economic shift from feudal agrarian way of life to the faster paced industrial world of factories and machines, mass production and quick profits. Industrialism also meant the rise of individualism. While trade and production increased and the nation became richer, the nation's prosperity concealed the wretched condition of the poor. There emerged a class of new rich entrepreneurs who had made quick money through the industrial production and posed a serious political and economical challenge to the traditional citadels of aristocratic power. Louis Casimir, identifies the polarization of the old aristocracy with the new bourgeoisie as a deeply antagonism indeed divided this new and thriving class of old order. The vehement aggression of these sons who rejected their heritage wounded the peaceful, patriarchal spirit of agricultural England, slumbering in the self-satisfied torpor. In the old society, everyone knew his place. The great families governed the country, the squires and the justices of the peace administered their own localities. But the demands of the new bourgeoisie, I'll pronounce it again. But the demands of the new bourgeoisie and the pressure from the Industrial Revolution introduced the ideals of the liberty and the enfranchisement to the new society, where hitherto material and mortal ties had changed the individual to his ancestors' station in his own locality. Men would have to cut themselves off from their native society and become free and independent, relying on the strength of their intelligence or wealth, if they had any, and their muscular strength if they had not. The fallen were trodden underfoot, so much the worse for them. Each for himself and the law of England for all was the motto of industrialism. These men were filled with pride when they contemplated the great wealth they had amassed from the product of their own energy, and they were engaged by the ridiculous impediments which still hindered the individual freedom. Remainders of feudalism, relics of old institutions, act of settlements, statutes of apprentices, and protectionist corn laws were all so many obstacles to the knockdown in the march of progress, or the march to the wealth. The belief that the individual's success depended on the ability to struggle and survive in a competitive world formed a core of the moral structure of this class of the people who were engaged in the ruthless competition for material prosperity. Thus, with the shift in the balance of power, a new set of social, moral, and ethical values evolved to replace the old order. In 1814, Jane Austen, the daughter of Tory parson, represented the conflict between the old and the new emerging social order in the Mansfield Park. The Mansfield Park, located in the idyllic pastoral landscape of rural England, is the home of Sir Thomas Bertram, who is the resident native chantry, the upper-class landowner. Fanny, from the lower middle-class family, is the first an outsider to Mansfield Park, but slowly she not only becomes an integral part of it, but represents an intrinsically the real spiritual and moral values of Mansfield Park, those of tradition, continuity, and order. In the novel, the older feudal value system triumphs and survives symbolically in the union of Fanny and Edmund despite a serious threat to it by outsiders. Propriety, regularity, harmony, and above all, peace and tranquility characterizes Mansfield Park. And in Austen's word, there is no place for kind of deviance indulged in the setup of feudal order is threatened only when Sir Thomas Bertram goes to Antigua for the purposes of business. This must be seen in the context of colonial and imperial expansionism of England at that time. The political expression of economic and social polarization was reflected in the agenda of the two main political parties in England, the Whigs and the Tories. The Tories were conservatives, supporting the landed class and the feudal economy, while the Whigs were the supporters of industry and its modern methods and the masters. 1.5 Romanticism. The American War of Independence and later the French Revolution formed the backdrop to Wuthering Heights, though both these important historical events seem to have no impact on events of the novel. The ideological discourse that provided the impetus for the Romantic movement's search for idealism and heroism emerged from these revolutions. Romanticism in many ways was a reaction to industrialism. It was a cry for the return to the world of innocent beauty that seemed to have been sacrificed to the dictates of the machine, and the individual liberty was very much the central theme of much of these discourses. The individual's creative power was located in his or her assertion of imagination and intuition that was to be freed from the limits of mechanical reason and the despotic rationality. The heroic was to be free. The heroic was redefined by revolutionary romantics, for they saw the heroic in the commonplace and the ordinary rather than in the extraordinary. With their radical stance, they repositioned the hero in the society, and his social responsibilities and relationships were scrutinized. The Industry Revolution and the accompanying French and the American Revolution can be seen as the revolutions that freed the individual from the moral, ethical, cultural structures and the constraints of the feudal order and left him to define for himself a new role. Now, the individual was responsible only to himself and to the high standard he sets for himself. This was now not only true of the man, but also of the woman, as we see them emerging with an independent individuality in novels of Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, Mrs. Gaskell, and later Hardy and George Eliot. 1.6 Rebellion. In contrast to Mansfield Park, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights is located in formidable landscape of barren heaths and moorlands. There is the intensity of nature in its raw and rather hostile manifestation. It forms the perfection backdrop for the drama to unfold, in which order, harmony, and security as seen as the edges of fragile world that is being threatened by immensely powerful forces of disruption beyond the comprehension of the people who live in that closed world. One fine summer morning, Mr. Earnshaw kisses his children and promises them gifts and steps out of the world and goes to Liverpool. The breach is made. After 3 days, he brings back with him a gift of God, a dirty, ragged, black-haired child. The star of the society from which the Wuthering Heights seems to have been isolated makes its symbolic entrance through Heathcliff. In Heathcliff and Catherine, we identify defiance of order and propriety, and in Edgar, we can see the valiant attempt at compliance with established value system. The defiance of Heathcliff and Catherine to follow prevalent social norms must be seen in the context of individual assertiveness of the industrial age in the twilight of the great feudal age and its hierarchic power structures. Wuthering Heights, which is challenged by Heathcliff and the ways of authority and the power of old system. I think I will read this again. Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange are in many ways symbols of authority and power of old system, which is challenged by Heathcliff and Catherine. Those who cannot adapt to the demands of the new age perish, and only the strong survive. It is within Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange that the forces of the challenge and subversion grow. According to Terry Eagleton, the Catherine-Heathcliff relationship is pre-social in the sense that it bypasses the society. This, according to Eagleton, is both novel's source of strength as well as its weakness. Its strength lies in its power of subversion and its revolutionary refusal to accept the contemporary society, which is exploitative and unequal. Its weakness lies in the author's inability to locate the meaning of the relationship in the immediate social terms. Eagleton points out that Heathcliff and Catherine cannot be united in the actual world. They are united only when they leave the real world, that is in death. 1.7. Let us sum up. Though the events in the novel seems to happen in remote and isolated place and characters with their intense emotion, particularly by Byronic Heathcliff, seems out the world, evidently Wuthering Heights is very much situated within the historical context. Since this was the only novel of the author, early biographical studies created an image of the author as a recluse, a shy but intense and brooding personality. A closer look at her life makes it obvious that Emily Bronte was not really cut off from the society around her and was quite aware of the changes happening around her. The changing character of the industry created new social classes with the economic interest that came in conflict with each other, and broke the social classes with broke the fabric of the traditional structure of the society. The potential of the individual, I'll read this line again. The potential of independent individual was stressed upon. The historical background prepares us for analyzing the characters as individuals caught in a changing society and their responses to it. It also allows us to evaluate Emily Bronte as a woman writer of the mid-19th century who was asserting her own intellectual position. I think by this we are gonna end this video, which is a reading of Background to Wuthering Heights, and we might begin with next unit soon. Till then, bye.